Okay, now my main point is that Buddha and Buddha's enlightenment is a scientific thing, and that Buddha was a scientist. And first I'm giving the gist of what he understood, his discovery, you could say scientific discovery. And this, of course, will probably come to many of you, and certainly from the long conversations we've been going on today, as a kind of a shock. But in a way, it's kind of interesting because we saw in this last thing with the consciousness thing, Deepak and Donald and Neil and Meena and so forth, that there's this issue of is consciousness primary or is matter primary? And of course, the current scientific orthodoxy is, of course, matter is primary, although the quantum people luckily throw that into question. But the Buddhist science, born out of Buddha's enlightenment, which is, we call it, is awakening, basically says that no theory about reality is ultimate. There's no description of relative reality, lived reality, that will be ultimate. So you really can't say, you can't say that reality is fundamentally consciousness or reality is fundamentally material, non-conscious. You can use reductionism, either materialistic reductionism or mentalistic reductionism, very effectively and powerfully. In the modern scientific and technological world, we've seen the powerful use of material technology. I think in the ancient, for thousands of years in the Buddhist world, we've seen powerful use of a mentalistic reductionist technology, inner technology, if you will. But both of the effectiveness of both of them, I believe, and I was particularly struck and encouraged by Dr. Stapp's statement in this respect, that the quantum revolution, if you will, brought back the mind into reality. And then it was denied and has been denied, and it certainly is denied in the orthodoxy in all of our universities at the moment. Okay, so with that connection to what just went before, let me begin. Now, the Buddha's key discovery is that the world, the ordinary person, does not perceive the world accurately, which they were saying too. It's quite exciting. But how is that described by the Buddha precisely? That relative reality is absolute. We feel that we are intrinsically existing the way we feel we exist. And the table and the floor and everything is really objectively what it is. That's our sort of naive realist view. We think we are absolute. Our rigid self-identity is the real us. We think, therefore, that things that are other than us are opposed to us. And if you're opposed to the universe in your feeling, you're going to be paranoid. You're going to feel that the universe will run over you. That's an obviously losing situation, which produces only suffering. So Buddha investigated this bad situation, and he found that he had been making a mistake, that we were making a mistake, that the fixed separate self is an illusion, his famous statement of anatma, or selflessness. His selflessness doesn't mean that you don't have a self. It just means that your view of yourself as an absolute is mistaken. You don't have an absolute self. You have a relative self. You are a process, a work in progress. And that process and work in progress is imprisoned by your image of yourself as having a fixed identity. That in reality we are free of intrinsic self-identity, that we're free of any non-relational, intrinsically real, that is real out of its own essence, fixed self, although ultimate selflessness is called the supreme self of selflessness. That means the supreme relative self that is aware of its selflessness and therefore resilient and therefore flexible and therefore capable of a higher level of function, which some religions have less helpfully called immortal and immaterial soul, as if there was an absolute somewhere else that is in us, although we can't find it, which supports a self-defeating delusion of isolated core self-identity from a Buddhist scientific point of view. So Buddha, realizing his freedom from that unreal and, in a way, psychosis-causing notion that our identity is a separate thing, absolute and unchanging, he enjoyed the release of his relative self from the prison of having to be a fixed identity. He realized experientially infinite interconnection with all life, beings, and things. And he felt that freedom and that release was a bliss. He felt it as a bliss. And then, however, he saw other beings as also really made of that bliss. Once he felt, it's like when you're in a certain mood, even we all know that. When you're in a happy mood, you sort of see the world as happy. Someone really in a bad condition or something you hear about, of course, will break that mood because it's only a slightly happy mood. But this supreme bliss that a Buddha or an enlightened being experiences, they then perceive every other being as more or less, you could say, made of bliss. On the other hand, they don't ignore the fact that those other beings don't necessarily see themselves that way. And then it's quite a point it must be for an enlightened being. I don't claim to be one for sure, but I imagine it must be. An enlightened being sees someone who is struggling and suffering as made of bliss, but sees that they think they're suffering and they're miserable and they're unhappy. And so that's when their compassion comes in. And it comes in by not ignoring their error and their entrapment and suffering. And that universal compassion inevitably causes such a being his non-dual continuing presence with us in our world. And this continuing presence is called in Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist sutras and things, that an enlightened being has what's called a body of truth, which body is the whole universe. A body of reality, maybe would be say, since we don't like the word truth here exactly. So body of reality. So you have a feeling like you are all of reality, apparently. And then you feel that all of reality as bliss. You have Sambhoga, body of beatitude. And then you have the ability to, then your consciousness indeed, as Deepak was saying there, if you're such a being, you can form from your consciousness material things, in theory. I mean, I'm not sure about that personally, but in theory you can form out of it what they call emanations in order to help other beings. And you can manifest many embodiments. Buddhists always have difficulty with the Christian theology in that they don't understand why a theory of an omnipotent deity would only have one sun in one place for one people teaching in one language, when an omnipotent being could be with many people in many languages and have a few daughters as well as sons, not only sons. So because the emanation body of an enlightened being has an unlimited capacity to benefit beings, they believe. So then there's this first, the realistic worldview, which is what we've been discussing all day today, which is in this wonderful dialogue that's been going on. And the realistic worldview, from Buddha's point of view, which is the first step in trying to awaken from our problems, is the acceptance of relational causation. People think that Buddhism, when people identify Buddhism as a religion, and then they think that there must be something you have to believe in, then, however, Buddhism doesn't ask for belief in anything that is non-rational. Buddha was very against blind faith. He felt if you believed in something for no reason, you were mentally crippled, and you would believe anything, actually, if for some reason you were forced to or something, some impulse to do it. And so it's not a reliable thing to have a blind faith. You should have a reasonable faith only in something. So the only thing Buddha asked as a realistic worldview or belief was the acceptance of causation, which was a very revolutionary thing at that time, because at that time in India, people believed that the gods caused things, that the gods were in control of the universe. So to look at a process of impersonal causal process as the key thing in the universe to gain some sort of improved situation in the universe was very revolutionary. And he made a famous mantra that everyone recites, Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetun tesham tathagata hiyavadat tesham chayo nirodho evam vadi mahasramaniye swaha. And that's all forms of Buddhism repeat that particular verse, which just means that the Buddha is one who understood about causation. He knew what were the causes of things. He knew also how to change the causes of things, of negative things, to remove the causes of suffering and achieve develop the causes of happiness. And so science, of course, works with causal processes, although in the quantum world, what actually is the causal process has become very complex and complicated. And then the Buddhist tradition really, therefore, is a science-based educational tradition to develop the inner being of human beings. So now, what were things that what did Buddha discover as a scientist that are beneficial to us today and that could have us realize what His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been working on for 40 years now, which in dialogues with Western scientists, which is a kind of complementarity of what you could call, from an Indian point of view, not only Buddhist, but a general Indian point of view, material sciences or outer sciences. And then the Buddhist sciences and yogic sciences in India, again, in general, they call in India Adhyatma Vidya, which means inner sciences or mental sciences. So the complementarity of taking the mind and using it as a science in a scientific way and understanding it in a scientific way, not just on some sort of a belief system or something like that. And the Buddha's discovery of emptiness or selflessness or voidness is actually a physical discovery. This is one of the like unconventional points, let's say, of my talk and my view. Why? Because the Buddha, in his meditation was not just a calming thing. We tend to think in popular speech in America, meditation is just sort of calming your mind. But actually, that is an important kind of meditation, as anybody who has an agitated mind knows. But the more important type of meditation is analytic meditation. It's called vipassana in Sanskrit, or vipassana in Pali. And it's a meditation that uses the one-pointedness of mind, the calmness of mind, the ability to concentrate with tremendous stability, sort of almost superhuman stability from our normal attitude of what our mind is capable of, and use that one-pointedness to analyze reality, like to examine objects, to examine the self internally, and to examine objects externally, and to try to see what they're made of, and to see how they work and how their causal processes work. And that's what Buddha was mainly doing there for his many years of meditation and under the tree. And what he did was he saw through objects, and he also saw through objects including his own body, and he saw through the self. And he came up with this insight, which he called emptiness, or voidness, I like to call it, which just means that everything that he focused on disappeared under analysis. And at the time, in India, there were atomic theories in the Vaisheshika tradition and in others, and they all, like Western science also until very recently, they posited something indivisible at the core of reality, that you could sort of, when you got down to it, would not dissolve under analysis, and therefore you build up, the dream was to understand how the world was built up from those irreducible particles. But the Buddha predicted then, without machinery, without cyclotrons, without microscopes, he predicted that everything dissolves under analysis, including atoms, including subatomic particles, including mental moments, including thoughts and mental states. They all dissolve under analysis. So not only matter, but mind also completely disappeared in his experience. And on top of that, and this is a very key breakthrough, which distinguishes perhaps his awakening from a number of mystical ones that we have in religious circles, that state of disappearance itself disappeared. That is, emptiness, he discovered that emptiness itself was empty. In other words, emptiness was the failure to find anything that could withstand analysis in the universe, even the universe. But that failure was not a thing. In other words, when you were sort of, your body and mind and every object was infinite space, experienced as infinite space, you experienced a dissolution into it, a melting, actually a blissful melting, they say. When you did, then the trajectory or momentum of his analytic quest of what is truly real looked at the space, but he wasn't anymore thinking verbally. He wasn't like a body floating in space, like someone levitating. There was no body, no space, no mind. But the trajectory of what is real analyzed the space, and he realized that that was a state of awareness and experience that had a boundary. In other words, he had come into it, and when he came into it, he felt this was the deepest reality. But on the other hand, it did have a boundary. So once it had a boundary, it was a relational state. It was not an absolute state. So then the minute that realization occurred to him, the differentiated world returned in a non-dual manner. That is to say, emptiness really means relativity. You may not have heard this from other Buddhist teaching, but emptiness means relativity, and no state of abstracted meditative release, like a state beyond everything, can be an ultimate reality, because otherwise such a state would destroy the relative reality, and that would just all be unreal and disappear, but it doesn't. So the emptiness is what enables all of our interrelationship and the causal process and the happiness and, unfortunately, suffering. But luckily, when one is fully aware of that experientially, there is no suffering. So I don't have much time, I want 9 more minutes, but emptiness becomes, therefore, the womb of compassion, it is said. That emptiness, rather than being a place where a person separates themselves from life and has a private bliss in some vast space, it only became the place where a sense of complete commitment to relativity and therefore to all other beings and to the removal of suffering and the sharing of bliss with all beings, it became, that's what emptiness is. It's this relativity. So he predicted relativity that Einstein came up with mathematically thousands of years later. The West caught up with that, getting out of its hard atoms owned by the British Empire and its solid reality of its colonial empire and so forth. And Einstein came up with the relativity, but Buddha predicted relativity even then. He predicted that everything dissolves under analysis, which I think contemporary science with their cyclotrons, they're still resisting that idea. They, you know, the Higgs boson, oh, we have mass here. Maybe that's something that will resist analysis. But then there's all that dark matter, cold dark matter that nobody knows what it is. That's marvelous. And that may also disappear under analysis, in fact. But so that's a physical thing. I'm just going to have to skip. Then, no, one other thing. Then biology. Karma theory, people tend to present and think it's some sort of mystical thing. Oh, did I have a former life? Maybe I was Cleopatra. Or maybe I was Julius Caesar or something. And or next life I want to live in California. I don't want to be in New York. And it's kind of like a mystical thing. And scientists who hear about it, or to their usually irritation that I've talked with, maybe not that people hear, but others, they say there's no evidence for it. But actually there is a tremendous amount of evidence for the continuity of consciousness. People remembering previous lives in great detail when there's no benefit for them, no profit, no fame. They don't get on the, a talk show, the late night show, because they remember previous life. In fact, it's inconvenient for them in many of the documented cases. And there's a lot of reasoning about the continuity of consciousness. And actually, there's no reasoning, and nobody has discovered that you become nothing. The one thing, in fact, we can all know scientifically and rationally is that nobody ever will discover nothing. It's really very easy. It's not even complicated. Or especially if they do discover nothing, they shouldn't expect a Nobel Prize. Hey, I discovered nothing, give me a prize. That's ridiculous. Nothing is a non-referring word. It means you failed to find something, and it's not a thing itself. So karma is actually a biological theory, and here I'm very encouraged by a recent book by Thomas Nagel, an NYU professor of philosophy, who says that he feels that materialistic reductionism is going to fail in its attempt to give a complete description of the universe, because it denies the existence of consciousness, which is really an obvious thing. Although, of course, it also dissolves under analysis, but still, in a relative lived way, it's obvious. And so he was calling for some kind of evolutionary theory that took the mind as a reality, saying that the reason he thinks scientists cling to the materialist dogma is that they feel the only alternative is some form of non-rational theism. And he was trying to say there should be a rational and scientific way of working with the mind, with consciousness. It doesn't have to be either or, like some kind of non-rational blind faith theism versus rational materialistic evolutionary theory. So karma already is an evolutionary theory where the mind is involved in shaping life. You are a human being because you are a moral and ethical being in your previous life. You may have been a lion or a tiger, but you were the nice lion and the tiger. You didn't eat the pregnant gazelle. You ate the stringy old one and let the pregnant one go ahead and have her little antelope or whatever it was. And you were a little more gentle, you were a little more other-regarding, a little more sensitive about the perspective of others, more altruistic as whatever other animal you were, and that's how you got to be. Your mind helped shape you to be attracted to the human form, to find the parents from the between state the Book of the Dead describes so well in Indians and Tibetans had, and you land in a womb and you become a human being. You are beautiful because you were not violent in previous life. You were patient and you were long enduring. And you are wealthy because you were generous in a previous life, actually, if you have wealth. And they have, those are just very simplistic, but it's much more sophisticated, different things that happen to people. The mind is involved, the parental genes are involved, but they have something they call a third gene, which is a mental gene or a spiritual gene, or you could call it even a soul gene. And that gene, it interacts with the parental genes, and that's what you are. So it's a very nice biological theory in the sense that the parent can't feel ever that they own the child or that they created the child. And so when the child says, this is my life, I'm going to do what I want with it, parent has to listen in the case of karma because the being came from their own previous evolutionary experience. And on the other hand, when the child at the teenage level says, I didn't ask to be born in this family, the parent can say, yes, you did. You picked us. You came out of the between. You came from your former life, and you landed in our womb, and now you're living in our house. So let's lump it, So anyway, so similarly, yeah. What?
The conversation you had with your
daughter?
daughter?
Oh, yeah, we had that. Daughter and sons, it gets a little rougher, but yeah, I've had it with my daughter. I have indeed, Steve. And so also that was connecting to other life forms. The creationists in America, here in America, in the Midwest and things, who can't stand the idea of Darwinian theory, they're especially freaked out by a sort of racist attitude and a speciesist attitude. They don't want to be connected to chimpanzees, to people with other hues, to female males. Maybe some males don't want to be connected to females, but in karma, every male has been a female and female has been a male, and these are just in next life you don't know what you're going to be. And finally, since I only have 3 minutes, the psychology, of course, was highly developed, and with the contemplative psychologies and technologies. India is, of course, the great yogic nation, but yoga is not just invented because the Indians they had yoga mats or something. Yoga was invented in India because it had to do with a scientific understanding with the way the body and mind are connected, the way your health connects to the rigidity or the flexibility and resilience of your body, and then also how breath connects body and mind, prana, subtle breathing, breath energy, and other subtle energies that operate in other parts of the body. A theory of qi, which the Chinese medical people have. And so then I have some other things connected to that. There's all kinds of Indian philosophy, and Sanskrit language is an amazing philosophical language, and their philosophical thinking is extremely subtle and way beyond, actually, until Kant and Wittgenstein and people like that, I think really a bit beyond what was going on in Europe. Then there are the great yogis of India and Tibet. Hinduism also connects to that, but I don't have time to go into their understanding of what kind of human capacity there is. You can learn to lucidly dream, you can learn to lucidly die, you can develop an awakening that does not get lost at death, you can be sure where you're going in a further life, not just by some church dealing with you, but by your own understanding of the way your mind works. And also one thing, the subconscious was totally discovered long before Freud, but the Buddhists don't tolerate that you should keep a subconscious. They believe you can become completely conscious of your subconscious, and the extraordinary feats that we hear of that yogis do have to do with getting into what is normally involuntary and unconscious, either in mind or brain or body, or what are called autonomic systems, and becoming consciously in control of those systems. And they definitely can, there is evidence that they've been able to do that. I don't pretend to be able to do it myself, but it can be done. They have a certain vision of body and mind, which I don't have time to do. And that's it. But then I just want to emphasize that the reason that this is not an either-or proposition in these last few seconds. Materialistic reductionism showed a great power is capable of being of great benefit to humanity. At the moment, the powers that is unleashed technologically are a great threat to humanity. Global warming, out of the technological magnification of greed, is definitely happening. And of course, the thermonuclear war could happen. and that also would be a kind of technology power that would be destructive. But I'm confident it can be constructive, but only if at this time in history, the Western arrogance that we have the greatest science, we have the only science, we understand reality, and we don't have to listen to the yogis of India, to the Buddhas of Asia. We don't have to try to become Buddhas ourselves as scientists. That idea should go, and the inner and the outer sciences should meet, and that's the end. Thank you very much.
Bob, thank you. That was cool.
Thank you.
Great.
Sorry to keep you from...
No. So we're going to walk out here. We got to get up and walk.
Question.
That was cool, wasn't it, Deepak? That was cool. Hey, so we're going to just take a couple of minutes, and we each want to ask you something. But
I'm just worried about the cook.
No, I know you've been worried. You worry about everyone. I mean, this is the thing about Buddhism, right? You're interconnected. It's all about love. And I guess my question, I'm going to be provocative here, is all the Buddhists that I know. You are introspective, connected to everything, love yourself. You're working on a project with CEOs and big, powerful people and getting them to diffuse their anger and love their enemies.
Yes.
Love. What
Yeah.
about hate? Where's hate? I mean, hate has its purposes. When you think about the evolution of things, differentiating, in a crowded marketplace requires choices, differences, and what I've always been interested in Buddha. Well, I know hates. I'm overstating for effect.
Okay.
But what about? If you convince these CEOs to love their enemies,
yes.
And let's just presume that they love the people they love anyway or like.
Yes.
If you love everyone, do you love anyone? In other words, where does differentiation fit in the model of that? And when you think about science, you think about evolution, you think about the connection, there's a lot of differentiation and choice. And so I'd actually mean it seriously, that if you do have a theory of love for everything, then it raises the question of actually, do you love anything?
Well, this depends on how you're defining love. Buddhism defines love as the will to the happiness of the beloved, with no element of possessive love. In other words, Romeo just wants Juliet to be happy, and vice versa. If it's requited or not, it doesn't matter. They just think that person is so great, whatever it is. So if you have...
I think Kira's great. Yeah.
So if you have such a love, there's no reason why if a single self-loving, narcissistic, egocentric, ignorant, unenlightened human being like me, like a New Yorker like me, I'm not pointing at you, but if such a person can actually forget about themselves and fall in love with somebody where they think that person is the absolute be-all and end-all, not just in the grabby way of like, oh, I want that, but I'd love that type of thing. And human beings can do it, and definitely they do. They're children. It's not always romantic. It's sometimes its own. But that's an expansion of identity. That's one of our abilities. So why should we not be able to expand it further? Why not? People love their country. People love their buddies in a war. People love all these sort of things. So love, why not? Why is it that I can't love Kira if I love you? I can't love you if I love Kira. That's possessive. That's not the true love. I can love you both. You should both be happy. Yeah, and the cook should be happy, so we shouldn't be too long. So that's now hate. About hate. Hate, maybe fight and flight. Although Deepak is the great teacher of how fight and flight is a very limited response. And but fight in his wonderful book on God, for example, I first encountered that analysis by Deepak. But the point is, hate maybe sometimes helps somebody out of a tight spot. But you ask your martial artist. Your martial artist, if he gets really mad at the other martial artist, he's going to be off balance, he's going to be thrown, he's going to lose. The great martial artist uses the energy of forcefulness in a calm manner, seeing the other being as just like imbalanced and wanting to, and turning their own violence back against them, perhaps to get them to calm down, not even wanting to really destroy them. And in a larger history, we have war as a big danger on the planet today. And war has been, perhaps there have been some wars that have been won. But the last 50, 60 years since nuclear weapons, have you noticed anybody winning a war? I don't think so. They all lost. And the great Jonathan Shell wrote that wonderful book about how war is obsolete. Because nowadays it's all civilian casualties, 95%, because of the power of the weapons. So you can't really conquer somebody and get them to do what you want. You just destroy them. The Powell Doctrine, for example, is an acknowledgement of that, that war is just totally destructive and therefore cannot really be won. And now, as we're seeing in the last couple of decades, it generates individual terrorism that is completely uncontrollable.
Can I just say that's a really, really great answer to my ridiculous question?
No,
that's a really,
okay,
yeah.
good.
Kira?
Good. Yes, Karen.
Quick question, since you
Yes.
were talking
Yes,
about
dear.
books, and I don't know if is my mic working?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is it working? All right, I'm going to hand it back to you real quickly, because you probably know all the wonderful books that Bob has written, and you talk a lot about why the Dalai Lama matters, and I encourage all of you to look into that. With regard to the Buddha we know and study, do you believe that anybody else has ever achieved the status of becoming a Buddha, besides Deepak, of course, equal to or superior to the Buddha that we know?
Oh, yes. Well, no, Buddha is there's different kinds of Buddhas. But Shakyamuni Buddha is defined as a Parama Nirmanakaya, supreme emanation body Buddha, because his whole life is designed as a teaching vehicle. You know, I mean, his earlobe teaches. You know, I mean, he has a little transistor in his forehead that radiates light rays and you get insight from, etc. He's like a real teaching machine. That's why, not just because of miracle, but the ability to help others understand their own reality and be liberated from their suffering. And, but there are infinite numbers of enlightened beings, definitely, many millions probably in history, and, but they don't always show themselves as a Buddha. Actually, and in fact, usually, I personally, and I think maybe some of you have that attitude, if anybody I know announces that they're enlightened, except for my wife, even Deepak, if he announces that he's enlightened, I will say, oh, thanks, and I'll take a hike. You know, usually the person who says they're enlightened is just, you know, they want something. They want adoration of disciples. In fact, the guru competition was so intense in this country recently. We had a kind of joking thing that a spa, a really successful spa, you should do like an Ushnisha job, you know, where you surgically put a tall dome on top of someone's head, or an earlobe extension to make them look more enlightened. You know, actually do cosmetic surgery to make them look like Buddha. That would be really profitable. All the gurus would show up and ask for extra facilities, you know. Because the truly enlightened person doesn't hold themselves above the people that they're trying to teach. Because the key to that enlightenment is that when you really feel the bliss in yourself, they say, and I don't pretend personal knowledge of this, I wouldn't dare. I have a Swedish wife, a Valkyrie. So she'd clown me if I ever tried to claim any such thing. But the point is, if you perceive this bliss in yourself, you see everyone else as really having that bliss in every cell of their being. And so you don't feel above them. But then you maybe can help if in case they are thinking, oh, I suck, which a lot of us do, actually. A lot of us have a kind of self-deprecation going on from our youth and from our culture, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we have a lowly expectation about things. And I'm the worst of it. I never expect things to work out right. And I worry about everything, as you say. We're too much. Don't have to worry here, because here we're in the hands of Deepak, our dear Deepak.
He has been a blessing to us, yes?
And we're now going to go to dinner. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Deepak. Thank you for inviting me. Born out of Buddha's enlightenment, which is, we call it, you know, his awakening, basically says that no theory about reality is ultimate. There's no description of relative reality, lived reality, that will be ultimate. So you really can't say, you can't say that reality is fundamentally consciousness or reality is fundamentally material, non-conscious. You can use reductionism, either materialistic reductionism or mentalistic reductionism, very effectively and powerfully. In the modern scientific and technological world, we've seen the powerful use of material technology. I think in the ancient, for thousands of years in the Buddhist world, we've seen powerful use of a mentalistic reductionist technology, inner technology, if you will. But both of the effectiveness of both of them, I believe, and I was particularly struck and encouraged by Dr. Stapp's statement in this respect, that the quantum revolution, if you will, brought back the mind into reality. And then it was denied and has been denied, and certainly is denied in the orthodoxy in all of our universities at the moment. Okay, so with that connection to what just went before, let me begin. Now, the Buddha's key discovery is that the world, the ordinary person, does not perceive the world accurately, which they were saying too. It's quite exciting. But how is that described by the Buddha precisely? That relative reality is absolute. We feel that we are intrinsically existing the way we feel we exist. And the table and the floor and everything is real. Okay, now my main point is that Buddha and Buddha's enlightenment is a scientific thing, and that Buddha was a scientist. And first I'm giving the gist of what he understood, his discovery, you could say scientific discovery. And this, of course, will probably come to many of you, and certainly from the long conversations we've been going on today, as a kind of a shock. But in a way, it's kind of interesting, because we saw in this last thing with the consciousness thing, Deepak and Donald and Neil and Meena and so forth, that there's this issue of, is consciousness primary or is matter primary? And of course, the current scientific orthodoxy is, of course, matter is primary, although the quantum people luckily throw that into question. But the Buddhist science, really objectively what it is, that's our sort of naive realist view. We think we are absolute, our rigid self-identity is the real us. We think, therefore, that things that are other than us are opposed to us. And if you're opposed to the universe in your feeling, you're going to be paranoid. You're going to feel that the universe will run over you. That's an obviously losing situation, which produces only suffering. So Buddha investigated this bad situation, and he found that he had been making a mistake, that we were making a mistake, that the fixed separate self is an illusion, his famous statement of anatma, or selflessness. His selflessness doesn't mean that you don't have a self. It just means that your view of yourself as an absolute is mistaken. You don't have an absolute self. You have a relative self. You are a process, a work in progress. And that process and work in progress is imprisoned by your image of yourself as having a fixed identity. That in reality we are free of intrinsic self-identity, that we're free of any non-relational, intrinsically real, that is real out of its own essence, fixed self, although ultimate selflessness is called the supreme self of selflessness. That means the supreme relative self that is aware of its selflessness and therefore resilient and therefore flexible and therefore capable of a higher level of function, which some religions have less helpfully called immortal and immaterial soul, as if there was an absolute somewhere else that is in us, although we can't find it, which supports a self-defeating delusion of isolated core self-identity from a Buddhist scientific point of view. So Buddha, realizing his freedom from that unreal and, in a way, psychosis-causing